and thank you very much for coming along once again. This evening we're going to look at a problem which we thought we solved a while ago, but in fact it's come back under a new administration. And the issue really is whether citizens can be informed about what's going on in the world at large, and in particular in reference to issues that are going to affect them directly in a changing environment and a changing climate. We're curious in general, and in fact the public is curious and they're concerned. So we're looking in particular at this whole question of learning for the curious and the concerned, exploring climate and environmental change with transition studies online. Transition studies is a new asset that's available out there on the web, and everyone can start to use it. And increasingly, we're going to want to start to use it because the kinds of information that we need to act upon as citizens is getting very confused in the public airwaves and in government statements. Transition studies aren't a mystery. They're pretty simple. And you can look on the Transition Studies website to get brief tutorials like these. What are transition studies? Steps towards a just and sustainable future. Basically, it has to do with this transformation, or the transition, from our current system based on overshoot and collapse as a guiding metaphor, to one based on sustainability. It's an entirely different paradigm, sustainability. It has to do with stopping the drawdown of the carrying capacity and leveling it out at the same time as leveling out the demand that we are placing on resources. And the two then need to be worked upon to develop a paradigm and a strategy for sustainability. The reason to make the change is pretty obvious. The Chinese had a saying, what's an old saying that showed up in a lot of Chinese fortune cookies, which is obvious. If you don't change direction, you're likely to end up where you're headed. Pretty simple statement. Absolutely true. The trouble is we're headed towards extinction very rapidly, and we need to change direction. And that's what transition studies are all about. They were recently described, outlined at the UN. You may have seen it. We're a fossil fuel dependent civilization, independent of what nationality we are. Our modern civilization is dependent on fossil fuels. We have to get to being a solar sustainable system. There's a bit of a transition, right? Transition studies are what's now in every discipline, every department, every university. Well, it may be in some sense intellectually, but it's clearly not swept the curriculum yet. It's just that every different department is working on transition of one kind or another. They may be economists working on economic transitions, they may be energy experts working on energy transitions, there may be agricultural experts working on agricultural transitions that are going to be needed for sustainability. Everyone's working on transitions. So the effort of transition studies is basically to create a clearinghouse for people to understand what transitions are being worked on where, and how can we find more out about them in order to not just be a passive reader about these things, but an active participant in these transitions. The reason for doing so is pretty simple. We need to focus on this because there is no planet B, right? We only have one Earth. We only get one chance. If we don't make the transition pretty soon, we're going to be out of a habitable Earth. One of the first things we have to do is a full cost accounting of fossil fuels. This is desperately needed. Every economist in the country and the world should be focused on full cost accounting of fossil fuels. We haven't done this so far. We've only looked at half of it. Take a look. We're facing the fact that we've done cost-benefit analysis and looked only at the benefits, not looked at the costs. The whole carbon bubble, the carbon moment in human history, is one great big gaspillage of a resource with no cost accounted for in terms of its impact on a global functioning ecosystem. If those costs were internalized, you'd be paying $57 a gallon for gas, right? So, yeah, we got to get the metrics straight, but we also just have to move off of carbon. Not because it's becoming more scarce. A few years ago, we used to think, and on one of the graphs I used, it was the peak oil question that was the great anxiety. We're going to run out of the stuff. Well, in fact, we're not going to run out of fossil fuels in any known future, especially with the new technologies used in fracking and the like. It's not the scarcity of the material, it's the impact of the material. We can't survive using that amount of carbon. Just on the post-Columbian city basis. Post-Columbian cities are those that were put in place after Columbus discovered, as it were, the New World. He didn't discover it because it wasn't lost, right? But in any case, the post-Columbian city was put in place, pretty much, at sea level. Because that's how he got here, right? On a boat. The post-Columbian city is under challenge. If you didn't see the graphic here, 1,400 cities in the United States alone. We can't survive in those cities with the combustion of terrestrial carbon. This is why the new movement that's emerging is called the carbon underground. We're trying to keep the carbon underground. And you start doing the metric for that, you measure progress in a very different way. Not how much carbon have you used, but how much have you sequestered? How much have you prevented from being used? Well, that's the challenge, and a full cost accounting would have to go into the question of what are the real costs and how can we sequester carbon fast? Well, journalists, professional journalists like Ross Gelbspan, who was a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist here in the Boston Globe for years and years, has been a lifelong champion for public access to scientific information to make this clear to people, and was among the first to get out in front of the wave even of scientists working on this and point to what is coming down the pipe, because he read some of the earlier scientific reports and was irritated at the fact that the journalists weren't catching up. He got out there on the stump and went to every high school he could get hold of, every college, and started a seminar here over at Harvard and Cambridge to talk about the way the information is being blocked from the public by very powerful interests. He wrote several books about it and went to explain it in every venue possible. It was staggering. The Heat Is On was his first, but he came out with another one called Boiling Point, How Politicians, Big Oil, and Coal, Journalists and Activists have fueled the climate crisis, and what we can do to avert disaster. It's a journalist sort of scolding the scientists for not getting their message out more clearly. And he damns the journalists. U.S. press coverage, a damning betrayal of public trust, is one of his articles on a website that he set up decades ago, actually. Just as soon as the internet made it possible, he got this information out because the Boston Globe wasn't publishing it at the time. And as he said, U.S. press coverage of climate crisis, a damning betrayal. It's a very amazing essay back in May 2010. Very worth reading at this point. Others followed. James Hogan came along with his Climate Cover-Up, a very important book, and Chris Mooney looked particularly at the Republican war on science, because during the Bush administration there was a definite effort to muzzle government scientists like James Hansen of NASA, who, among others, on a panel, he was one of 6 people, actually 5 people on a panel to the Senate, who in June 1988 said, listen, there is a climate signal in the CO2 concentration, and it indicates we're causing climate change. Humans are causing it, and we better do something about it soon. He made this very clear, and it was that work that Ross Gelbspan then began to take to the journalists in the wider world on a much more public basis. But the response of the administration, as you can see in the cartoon of George Bush here, and the FBI agent, was to muzzle him. Basically, yes, he's holding up the climate science material at the testimony before the Senate, but as Bush is quoted here saying, we're reducing dangerous emissions. The emission here is the emission of a scientist saying, listen, we've got to do something about this. But it wasn't limited to the Bush administration. Under Obama, Hansen and many other scientists got themselves arrested in front of the White House, pointing out that Obama was not pursuing a climate-friendly policy with the XL pipeline. And in fact, there was their militancy which got Obama to reconsider it. So censoring science has actually become quite an industry on the part of those who are trying to fight the scientific information. The book written by Mark Bowen detailing this came out in paperback as well, and you could see from his subtitles inside the political attack on Dr. James Hansen and the truth of global warming. Books have now come out detailing the way in which the government suppressed the information and tried to muzzle its key spokesman from the scientific world, Dr. James Hansen. Well, others have gone into the study in great depth. Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway came out with a book called Merchants of Doubt, which made it very clear that there is big money behind this kind of thing. And, in fact, other books have come out pointing out that they're investing in lies on a regular basis, systematic attempt to confuse and, in effect, befuddle the public. This book, Lies Incorporated, had the subtitle, The World of Post-Truth Politics. Post-truth politics. Well, the key people behind financing this were the Koch brothers.
The Koch brothers have made billions and want to ensure the government doesn't limit their ability to make more. Koch Industries is the second largest private corporation in the U.S. They've made those billions through coal, chemicals, and oil, including Alberta's.
We think this is a great opportunity for Koch.
They are the largest foreign leaseholders in Canada's oil sands, and one of their key political aims has been to fight environmental regulations.
Do you believe in climate change yourself, Mr. Cook?
Right here. The climate does fluctuate. It goes from hot to cold. We have ice ages.
They've funded universities and think tanks, one here in Canada, the Pro-Oil Sands Fraser Institute. And the Kochs have put together powerful advocacy groups with private donors like Americans for Prosperity.
Pick up your torch. Spread the light.
It buys ads promoting the group's agenda. And year after year, Star, Tea Party, and Republican candidates have lined up to seek their support.
Make some noise for Senator Ted Cruz!
Please join me in welcoming Jeb Bush. Join me in welcoming Senator Marco Rubio.
But as the Kochs plan their biggest political spending spree ever, they're now facing a new world with a billionaire who doesn't need their money.
Let's put this thing away.
And a socialist who collects small donations and rages against the super rich.
Okay, well, we all know the history of that encounter. We also know the outcome of it. It's interesting to look a little bit at the way the Kochs accomplished their goal over time. Take a look.
This is Charles and David Koch, oil barons with personal fortunes of over $21 billion each. Perhaps their greatest achievement is helping convince the world that global warming doesn't exist. In the early 1990s, a scientific consensus began to emerge that burning fossil fuels, such as oil and coal, was changing the Earth's climate. In order to protect profits, these industries devised a plan to reposition global warming as a theory and not fact, and designed what a recent Greenpeace report dubbed the climate change denial machine.
It's a network of corporations and think tanks, front groups, who try to lie about the climate science, stop policies that will solve global warming. Of all the dirty energy money that's coming into Washington trying to influence policies, Coke is the worst. Coke is the largest donor, and nobody's ever heard of it.
The denial machine works like this. As citizens, we generally don't trust what energy industry representatives tell us about climate change. But we do trust these messages when given to us by experts or by our peers. In 2007, Coke paid scientists to publish a bogus study that polar bears weren't being affected by climate change. They've invested millions of dollars turning George Mason University into what Mother Jones magazine called the haven for climate deniers, and even underwritten denier conferences. But while the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change brought together over 600 authors from 40 countries for their latest report, renowned skeptic Steve Malloy admits that his side is vastly outnumbered.
It's really amazing, and it's really sort of a band of about 25 people, I guess, maybe a few more. And most recent polls show that more people feel more strongly on my side than on the Al Gore side.
Okay, that's the ratio. 640 trained scientists working on the climate are pushed over by ad firms and paid stooges in the academic world, 25 of them at most. It's a staggering success, a big investment on the part of the Koch brothers. It's called the Koch machine, and you can see how it's worked. It worked so thoroughly that EPA is basically now a totally owned subsidiary. Take a look.
Scott Pruitt, the head of the Environmental Protection Agency, has decided that his best course of action when dealing with climate science, a subject that he knows absolutely nothing about, his best course of action is to reach out to a group that knows a thing or two about climate change. In fact, the thing or two that they know is how to deny it and spread misinformation about it. That group just happens to be the Heartland Institute, a climate change denying organization that over the years has taken funding from both the Charles Koch Foundation and ExxonMobil. Scott Pruitt has specifically reached out to the Heartland Institute to help him put together a, quote, red team whose job it will be to go through climate change science that gets presented to the EPA so that they can go through and critique it.
Okay, you can see. It's a kind of phony effort on the part of EPA director. The president himself, of course, appointed the head of ExxonMobil, the CEO, as Secretary of State. And a very revealing photo, which is quite embarrassing to anyone who looks at it. They were fooling around when he was sworn in as Secretary of State, and President Trump gave him the chair to sit in as he signed the indication that he was becoming Secretary of State, gave him the chair of the presidency to sit in. It occurred to a lot of people that we're moving from alternative facts to a kind of alternative reality. And we really have to ask, have our leaders and the media that follows them, the media didn't raise a single objection to this whole thing. Have they lost their grip on reality? Have we just witnessed the ultimate corporate coup d'etat in a newly reorganized petro-extractive state? Only America, says Trump. But is it only America, or is it only Exxon first? It's not clear. Well, scientists within the government are sounding the alarm in any case, and they're leaking government reports. The media has not caught up to the scientists on this yet. But there's another problem brewing. In the secondary schools, the Koch brothers have invested, along with the Heartland Institute that you just heard about being appealed to by Secretary Pruitt to help him counter the climate science, they're funding secondary school confusion.
As kids head back to school, their teachers are finding they have more questions than they used to. Fueled by internet skepticism, some of them wonder about climate change, evolution, and even whether or not the Earth is round. That can be a challenge for science teachers. Avi Wolfman-Arendt reports from WHYY in Philadelphia.
Patrick Engelman likes to play a little trick on his students.
Right, plays a little trick on his students, but listen now, it's not a joke.
And she recognizes it's tough these days for students and teachers to sort science from spin.
I think it's harder with this information explosion to know how to negotiate through all this information that is available to you.
So if correcting students is the wrong tactic, what should science teachers do? At a seminar UN leads, this very topic comes up. Nick Garal, a student teacher, tells the class that some of his middle school science students in Philadelphia think the Earth is flat. They got the idea from basketball star Kyrie Irving, who said...
Okay, they're getting their ideas from basketball stars, not from scientists. And even the government agencies are getting them from the Heartland Institute, a group of people who are, in fact, all discredited in their scientific background. Now, there are scientists who are blowing the whistle on this, basically. And they wrote, in this particular case, this individual wrote a column in the Washington Post. But he wasn't alone. 450 other scientists are presenting stunning rebuke to Trump's climate science denial. And it's a staggering report. Basically, the government scientists leaked the latest scientific report that they've got before Trump could get his hands on it and censor it. It's a very important report, and you can get access to it through Transition Studies directly. But this raises the whole question: how can you inform yourself with active efforts on the part of government to rep up climate protections and to change the terminology? The U.S. Federal Department of Agriculture, USDA, has forbidden the use of climate change in their discussions. It's a real question of whether we're facing the end of the EPA. Trump taps this climate denial and fossil fuel ally. That's an understatement. He's a fossil fuel advocate, not just ally. He's a promoter of fossil fuels. The trouble is that we haven't gotten on to discussing the big problem of how to move off fossil fuels, but onto solar systems. Take a look. Second point about other alternative energies: use the renewable ones. Don't fall into the trap of thinking that nuclear is a solution to anything. If you want to look at externalized costs, think about the tens of thousands of years of waste products that you have to deal with. We don't even have human languages that have persisted long enough to label this stuff. The new techno-scientific approach is to emphasize nuclear, but this is clearly not going to be a solution for sustainability. It'll just make extinction more swift and efficient. Civilizations based on non-renewables will not be renewed. That's as simple as it is. They will perish. How can the average citizen navigate this quagmire of complex data and deliberate obfuscation? Well, I can start to investigate these things on Transition Studies with a whole series of indicators for where you can start reading various books. There are indicators for film festivals, for extending climate awareness and effective action in your town, in your church, in your synagogue, in your civic organization of any kind. Some government agencies are still publishing very valuable data, and you should get hold of this at climate.gov. But Trump is deleting climate change one site at a time, The Guardian reports. So you got to get out there fast. Also, start drawing upon things which are regularly put in transition studies from the major universities. Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, Yale, and the others were creating new platforms for global learning. This has to be a new kind of collaboration to devise a transition to a sustainable future.
This is Tom Chomsky. You're watching